In this video, we're going to cover how to measure your emissions as part of the United Nations Climate Change Challenge. And if you look at the website about measuring your emissions, you'll see there's a section in here that talks about calculators. Then if you click down here, you'll see calculators for organizations. And you can download this, and when you download it, you'll see an Excel file that has many different tabs in it. So here's the emissions calculator, the information and sources, the report where you actually collect all the information, but then a whole bunch of data tabs where people are supposed to go in, your suppliers are supposed to go in and fill out all of this information and then submit this back to you. And then you're supposed to compile this across all of your supplier relationships in order to have a complete picture of your greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very difficult thing to do. Many companies instead are turning towards building out some type of a custom database application where you have to go in and mimic all of the data fields that are set up inside of this Excel workbook and then try and figure out some way to get this out to everybody and have that information filled in by different people. We'd like to suggest there's a better way to do this. And the better way to do that is working with Boardwalk Tech and our Boardwalk Digital Ledger. And if you take a look at the exact same Excel workbook, what we do is we say, well, let's take the information that's inside the workbook and let's work with it as though it's a three-dimensional spreadsheet that has a user and time component, and it also has an access control component. So you can come in and say that same information in the standard workbook where I'm collecting data. So let's, for example, take a look at the fuels one. You can say, oh, I do need to collect this fuels information specifically across all these different dimensions. But if you'll notice on the left-hand side here, I'm saying I want to take this data and I want to be able to collect it from multiple people at the same time. And you can go in and say inside of the Boardwalk Digital Ledger that I'd like to be able to collect this information, but I want to be able to collect it from different people, and you can apply access control to the data based on the actual information that's in the workbook itself. So if you look here I have an access control set up that says, oh, well, when the user supplier logs in, I want them only to see the rows where supplier shows up in that particular row of data. So that means when they're interacting with the data, they only see the data for fuels. Likewise, when you go into the freighting goods, you can see here's the section associated with the freighting goods data. And then as you get down here, it's now repeated for the second supplier. Now, the interesting thing about the Boardwalk Digital Ledger is you can have millions and millions of rows running in this database because it actually is a SQL Server database run in the cloud that just happens to use Excel as the user interface. Everything else is exactly the same for the different users. And in fact, what you're able to do is you're able to send out a blank workbook to all of the users, all the suppliers that you need to interact with, and say, I need you to provide information to us in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. So how would that look? Well, that would be sending out a blank workbook. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's pull up this one. And if you take a look at this, there's nothing in here at all. And I say, I want to download the data. And when you download that, and actually I should say before you do that, you can say, I've got thousands and thousands of suppliers that I'm working with. So you can come in and you can say, well, which data do I want to be able to see from which supplier? Because remember, this is a database that just happens to be using Excel as a user interface. But then when you say, well, which data I want to download, I can come in here and say, I'm the supplier, and I'm going to say that put in a password, because you have to have a password in order to access the data. And then what the system does at this point is it's gone through the credentialing process. It's getting the information for that particular supplier and bringing it down to Excel. So Excel in this case is acting simply as a user interface to the information in the database. And you can do this one time and keep it as an Excel file on your desktop, or you can have the supplier go back and forth multiple times, because now the information, so for example, when I come over here in fuels, and you remember when I showed you that before, it had all those different rows in here, but now it only has the rows for this supplier in here. Because of access control, that's the only information that I put in. So then you can come in and say, well, I'm going to go ahead and make this be 6,500, and then I'm going to say these are my updates, and I say I'd like to push this information out to the Boardwalk Digital Ledger. And when you say submit this, say these are my changes. And again, what happens often when you're doing this type of work, right, is you have to collaborate back and forth with the people that you're providing this information. Well, in the case of the Boardwalk Digital Ledger, the collaboration is simply clicking on submit refresh, and the data can get pushed back and forth between the users, and it also makes note of when everything was changed. You can see here this is showing what the most recent data was that was changed. And you can go through and basically do this on all the different tabs. So I can come in and say, I'm going to make this be 14,000, and then this distance is going to be 12,000 that's being traveled this year. And then I may also have an attachment that I want to include with this data. So I can say, oh, well, I want to be able to upload information about my CHG fuel. So I'm going to say CHG fuel 2 and say I'm going to select this file, and the file is my emissions report right here. And I say push that out. Now that takes this information, attaches it to this individual cell, and then pushes it up to the Boardwalk database. So you can see now this information for the fuel data was just put in. And so then I can say, okay, this has now been completed, so I'm going to submit this change as well. And now this takes those changes for my updates and pushes it out to the Boardwalk Digital Ledger. And you can set it up, of course, where it does everything at the same time. But this cell level data sharing has now pushed the changes for these two different tabs out to the workbook that's being managed by you as the company trying to collect all this data. And if I now come back and say, well, let's go take a look at this other tab. So if I say switch back to the supplier manager, then I come here back to my fuels and I say, well, let's refresh this and see what has been done out there. And what you'll see now is the changes done by that user are being pushed in at a cell level into the workbook that you're looking at. So this is very important, because if you think about other database applications and somebody changes something, you can't tell what's changed. But here it tells you that the data value changed from 6,400 to 6,500. And the comments are in here as well. And you can come in at any time and say, show me a history, for example, over the past quarter of the changes that have been done to that cell. And then you have a history of all the changes without having to do any logging or any other type of work associated with the database. And likewise, when I come in here and I say refresh this workbook or this particular tab, now you can imagine that you've got all of your different suppliers that are providing this information. And this information is now being automatically rolled up. So here again, you can see those changes that we did. Also the new update for the attachment was there. And what's great is that all this information across all your different suppliers is automatically rolled up such that you're able to now have a complete view of all the information based on the calculator for collecting greenhouse gas emissions. But there's more to it than that, and that's another part of the Boardwalk Tech story, is to say, well, in addition to the data that's inside of Excel, I need to be able to have a workflow process to be able to go in and actually understand how much information is being sent back and forth between all of the participants associated with greenhouse gas. And in that case, there's a lot of unstructured data that has to be worked with. And in order to work with that product, we have what's called the Boardwalk Unity Central. And in Boardwalk Unity Central, you're able to go in and organize information much like you do inside of email to say, I need to be able to collect a bunch of different information from all these different suppliers. And this is some of the information that I've collected up from this particular supplier. And if I say, well, let's go grab a particular data element, so some of these results right here, and bring it into this environment here, then I can take a look at that. And as soon as it's brought in, that same data that was in the Excel file, at least the initial data, is brought in. And then if you want to go in and say, for example, I'd like to run what's called a ripple and just say on fuel and say, find me all the information associated with fuel, then it'll look through all of the data that was brought in terms of the inputs, the data from the various suppliers that you're pulling all this data in, and then you can see how these things have changed over time. And very importantly, as the data is changing, it's being updated as it shifts over time. But we believe, most importantly, that this information has to be notified when things are changing. So we have the ability as part of the notification space to say, hey, some new information's come in, but you're also able to go in and work with this as part of a flow. And if I come in and I say, well, let's take a look at the greenhouse gas emissions and say, what information do I have to be able to collect from different people associated with this process? well, here's the calculator itself. Then I want to be able to get data about the organizational information, fuels information, freighted goods information. Remember, I just selected a couple of those different tabs. But these are the generic steps associated with any type of a process flow. And then you're able to put in here how long this should take. So in this case, I'm saying once you first set up the calculator, then you expect after 5 days to be able to get some information. And then there'd be a certain amount of time after that that they would send you information about fuels or information about freighted goods. And in this case, for the demo, we've only put in 2 or 3 minutes, because what we want to show you is that when you go in and you look at an instance now says, well, let's take this standard operating procedure and now make it be active for a particular supplier. And then as that information's coming in, it's going to start telling you, well, how am I doing? Is everything that I'm supposed to be getting actually arriving or not arriving? And you can see what are the expected steps, when are they supposed to be done, and has anything been delayed or is anything late? And what's very interesting is there's a lot of information that is sent back and forth associated with working with unstructured data, for example, with emails, that you want to have line up with the appropriate information inside of a flow. So if I come back here and I say, well, let's go back and I want to refresh this information associated with emails, because remember I sent that email earlier. And now I say, well, where would email information that gets sent in show up in the context of the information that we're supposed to work with? Well, you can see right here, here's that email that I sent in that has that information. And now you can see that if other information's coming in addition to the steps that are being done, you're automatically seeing all of the unstructured data that's associated with any of the particular projects or suppliers that you're working with. And if I say, well, let's take a look at my greenhouse gas and say, take a look at this one that I just worked on and say, show me, all the dates. I'm going to say the entire period. Then this is going to look at the documents that have been brought in. In this case, I've only had a couple of them, but it's telling me that there's a delay. Remember I showed you that delay earlier, and it's also giving me a proactive alert about something that is only 70% completed, and it keeps track of what are the documents that are supposed to be coming in, what are delayed, what are the proactive alerts, and have I received all this information. And if you step up one level higher, you can look at a report and say, hey, I want to be able to see all of the reports across all of my suppliers for all of the outstanding greenhouse gas emissions that I have out there running. And you can see that it says that there's different instances that have been put in, how many have been run, how many are delayed, how many documents are there. Then you can go in and do comparisons against different suppliers to say if some of them taken longer than they were supposed to be able to do it. And you can go into specific areas. So if I go and take a look again at this one and I say, hey, there's a problem with this supplier and this information is not coming in, then you can chat directly inside of Unity Central and say, hey, I want to be able to send that file or flow or a RIPL query out to them and say, can we please resolve this so that we're able to get all of our greenhouse gas emissions pulled back together. So with the Boardwalk Digital Ledger and Boardwalk Unity Central, you now have a complete solution for being able to manage your greenhouse gas emissions and collecting all this information from your suppliers. Thank you.